We're starting our section on specialty courts. So a few different kinds of specialty courts we're going to go over, juvenile courts being the first one. We have some drug courts, some mental health courts, things like that. Just give me a brief start. So yeah, drug courts, mental health courts, juvenile courts, things like that. We already went over federal courts and state courts. Those are our generic or general entry-level courts and our appellate courts, but we have special courts, family courts, things like that. Why do we need special courts? Why divide stuff up?
Spread the caseload out.
That's a big part of it, yeah. I mean, there's just a lot of cases out there, especially in larger jurisdictions. You need to just help the caseload. What about special? What about them makes it special? Like, why do juveniles themselves need their own court? I'm sorry? Yeah, age. I mean, that's so. What makes a juvenile then? Legally, what makes a juvenile? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. That can factor in on it, but I think most people would normally say it's under 18, and that's a pretty good definition. But as far as a legal definition, juveniles are going to go to juvenile court as long as they're not being treated as adults. That's kind of the catch-all, which could be because you're 18, but it could be for a number of other reasons too. So we also have kind of biases against, I think in general, society has some biases against criminals. A lot of folks just really want don't want to have contact with criminals, don't want to have, be victimized by criminals, and just want them out of society. There's a segment of the population that would just, lock them up and throw away the key. Don't worry about rehabilitation, don't worry about, I just never want to deal with it. It's just easier, because none of us want to be a victim of a crime. I don't think anybody here is going to volunteer to get their car broken into, or their house burglarized, or have something stolen from them. So this inherent bias against folks that are going to do that is going to maybe harm any rehabilitative, restorative efforts that folks might make. So let's talk about biases. Well, let's define it. Let's you'll be my first since you walked in here. You'll be my first volunteer here. How would you, in your own words, no book words, how would you define a bias? Doesn't matter if it's racial, age, criminal, like just. I mean, you're gonna think about folks, some segment of the population different than another segment, right? If somebody's going to be, and we'll keep the same subject, we'll keep it easy. If somebody's going to be biased against criminals, how would they act towards those criminals? Yeah. So if you were a judge and you had a bias, we'll make that's the example in the book. If you were a judge, you had a bias against a criminal, if you had a bias against criminals, what would be some of the repercussions of that, the consequences of that? This is the last one. I'm sorry? Yeah, punish it, exactly, yeah. 100%. Punish them differently. Then maybe the schedule would dictate. Because sometimes, I mean, judges have kind of guidelines, guidelines they can abide by. You have things called indeterminate sentences and determinate sentences. Sometimes you're told, like, hey, it's going to be, if you get convicted of this, it has to be 30 years. That's what you get. And sometimes it says, oh, it's going to be between 5 and 15. Well, if you have a bias against criminals, are you more likely to sentence that person to 5 years with some probation and maybe some rehabilitative efforts, and maybe if they're motivated by addiction, get them into a rehab and things like that? Or are you more likely to give them the full 15 years and say, society just washes their hands of them? Yeah, I think you're more likely to do the harsh one instead of actually trying to better that person. Do you think that there is some merit in that first half? If somebody's addicted to drugs, and that's why they're breaking into cars, if we give them a smaller jail sentence and longer probation and longer rehab, and make them go to rehab, make them go to inpatient services and actually try to get unaddicted or get past the addiction to drugs, is that going to serve the same purpose as scaring somebody away from crime? If somebody no longer is addicted to drugs and no longer has to break into cars, then I think we can agree that they're not going to break into cars usually. Or if you put them in jail for 15 years, they're also not going to break into cars for 15 years, right? So we serve the same purpose, but one, we don't have to supervise them in prison for a long time. We don't necessarily, take away their freedom for 15 years to get to the same goal. We don't have to pay to house them and feed them for 15 years. And in the end, maybe their life is a little more well off with a short prison sentence. Maybe they're able to get a job. I would imagine maybe it's a little easier to find a job if you didn't necessarily get sentenced to prison, or you get a short prison sentence versus coming out of prison after 15 years and not having any work skills. So one of the things the book talks about is this judge bias. Have you ever heard the term implicit bias? I don't know if the book talks about it. So implicit bias are these biases, like you may know that you have a bias against criminals, but maybe you don't realize you have a bias. Implicit bias a lot of times has to do with a bias, like a racial bias and things like that, where you are treating somebody differently without even realizing you're doing it. So you're not overtly thinking like, oh my goodness, I'm racist. I hate this group of folks and I'm gonna treat them poorly. But just through your own environment, the way you were raised, the folks you hung out with, the experiences you had, negative and positive experiences you had, you just start to form these kind of in the back of your head, like, okay, well, you make some assumptions and you don't even realize you're doing it. There's a test, Harvard has one of the more common ones. It's an implicit bias test. You can find it online. If you Google the implicit bias test, essentially, I'll break it down for you. What it does is it gives you a couple different scenarios. So you put your finger on two different keyboard buttons, and it'll say, okay, if the word is a good word, hit the E. If the word is a bad word, hit the I. And this just says how fast you do it. So it'll say things like beautiful. Well, that's a good word. Ugly, happy, angry, and it just goes back and forth and maybe it'll throw a few bad ones and throw a few good ones in there. Then it'll say, okay, well, see a picture of a black person, hit the E button. If you see a picture of a white person, hit the I button. And you just go through that. Simple enough. And then it'll say, okay, well, now if you see a picture of a black person or a bad word, a white person or a good word, same thing. And then it'll switch it up. If you see a picture of a black person and a good word, a white person or a bad word, hit the button. And at the end, after you take all these tests, it ends up judging the speed at which you hit the buttons. And in general, what they have found is that folks tend to, when it is white and good versus and black and bad versus the other way around, they're a little quicker to hit those buttons. They hit the button faster than having to think about it. So it's interesting how they're essentially saying that folks have a bias and they have to think about it a little bit longer if they're associating good words with persons of color. But I wanted to share that with you because it's an interesting little experiment you can do at home and just test yourself and see what they say. But that's, once these biases, these kind of in the back of your head biases that they saw that judges had, once they pointed them out, they stopped being necessarily in the back of their head and started being in the front of their head, and they can actually start making informed decisions about their sentencing. And that's where juvenile justice comes in, because juvenile justice is a more informed justice system, because we're not necessarily throwing juveniles away and locking up the key in general. What we want to do is rehabilitate them because they've got their entire life ahead of them. If you have a 40-year-old murderer who has, on average, another 40 years left on the planet, there's not as much effort to rehabilitate that person as a juvenile who, even if they did commit murder or did commit a shooting, maybe can be rehabilitated and brought back and be a productive member of society eventually. It's not necessarily that throw away the key type of mentality. So we talk about like serious crimes, like I've said it many times in these classes, I use extremes on purpose. Murder, robbery, like very violent crimes. But not all crimes that juveniles commit are violent crimes. Anybody read about status crimes in the book? Can you tell me what status crimes are? Status offenses. They're crimes per se, like crimes, but they're not, they're not robbery or burglary, the actual really in serious offenses. They're things like running away from home, being incorrigible, means like not listening, smoking, underage drinking, things like that, they're technically against the law. But we don't treat those types of offenders nearly as bad as we treat violent crime offenders. We realize that juveniles are just going to make bad choices. If your brains aren't fully developed, you're just not going to make the same informed decisions about life as you are if you're an adult. So let's start out with the history of how we came up with some of these juvenile justice rules and laws. So we had things called poor laws, 1601 poor laws, because they kind of came about up to and leading to the year 1601. They realized that there are just folks that aren't given the same opportunities as other folks, adults or juveniles. If you're poor, and that's why they call it poor laws, if you come from a lower socioeconomic background, sometimes you're just not afforded the same opportunities that somebody with a lot of money. Sometimes you have to, and especially back then when there wasn't a social safety net, sometimes you just gotta, maybe you have to steal. Maybe you have to, if you're gonna feed your family, make sure your kids don't starve, you're just gonna have to steal something. If somebody does that, should they necessarily be punished the same as somebody who had the means and just decided they didn't want to work for it? Probably not. I mean, as a community, as a society, we kind of came together and realized, well, what are we going to do about these people that can't afford to do things, but they end up breaking law, especially children. So in those days, if the children got separated from their parents, what else are they going to do? There was no, there wasn't necessarily the truancy laws that kept them in school. Maybe they just have to end up breaking the law. And we need, as a society, we need to find a way to take care of these kids. So we end up putting them in some sort of facility. They started out with charities. These charities would essentially, what they promised to do was, hey, we'll take these kids in, and even adults, because those poor laws incorporate adults. Hey, we'll take these folks in and we'll put them on a farm and we'll help them out. We'll give them, we'll let them work, because that was one of the things. Unlike, these are the precursors for our welfare system. And not every, you'll hear a lot of folks say, like, if you're on welfare, you should always be looking for a job, or you need to work for handouts. There shouldn't be free handouts, what some folks say. So back in those times, 1600s, 1500s, it was the same mentality. If my tax dollars or my charity dollars are going to go to somebody to help them out, they should work for this money. Somehow put in some effort and earn it. So they would volunteer, okay, we'll put them on this farm and we will give them some work so they can earn some money. How can that go wrong? Or how do you think? I mean, what ways do you think that went wrong? Bringing folks in to work on your farm in exchange for a place to live and some food. That's part of it. And then the opposite, exactly the opposite. So she said they didn't want to work. That could be part of it, because folks, sometimes not everybody is motivated. But then not everybody is honorable. So if you owned one of those farms and suddenly you had this influx of labor, it's not a far stretch from you're giving them food, you're giving them a place to stay, and they have to work for you by law. What does that sound like in the 1800s?
Slavery.
Yeah, sounds a lot like slavery, right? A nice way of A nice word for that is indentured servitude. It has that word servitude in it, like servants, right? Indentured servitude is what that ended up kind of bastardizing itself into. So we take some of these same ideas, because these are all, when we talk about 1500s, 1600s, that's long before the United States, right? That's long before the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution. These are all British ideas. But when we came over here, we're going to talk about it in the court system. Even when we talk about the courts, the states and the federal court ideas, we brought those over from England and then we made them our own. So these juvenile ideas came the same way. We had this idea of we need to take care of the poor, we need to take care of the children, we need to not necessarily throw the book at them. But once we came over here, we started giving it our own spin. The New York House of Refuge, that was one of the very first of these farms, but it wasn't a farm, it was, it was urban. And they were the first ones to take folks in. And if, I really want you to remember the name of that. Lost my balance. Really want you to remember the name of that home, the New York House of Refuge. Again, they would bring folks in, the poor and the juveniles, and in exchange for a place to live and some food. They would give them jobs to do, but just like a farm, except in an urban environment, those jobs ended up being more and more laborious for less and less pay. And I don't know how the food quality was, but you end up getting free day labor essentially, and it just didn't work out. It wasn't as quality or productive as folks had this butterflies and rainbows perspective of it. Conditions ended up being really bad, and we realized that we really need to have some oversight to that. And that's when the first juvenile court system started coming into play. Instead of just taking volunteers to take these kids off the street with no oversight, we started having juvenile courts. And those were right around 1899 was when they first started being developed. But then we, as we learn, as we grow, originally the juveniles were being treated in the court system, at least, the same as adults. They're being tried the same way. They're being, the rights are the same. I think, can we agree that juveniles, folks that are far less than 18, should be afforded more rights in a criminal justice system than adults? What rights do you think they should have? What should a juvenile? If we were going to create rights or write down some rights, what about their parents? I know we talked a lot about abandoned children and children kind of on their own on the streets, but do you think if you're arrested right now, if a police officer arrests an adult, do they have to tell anybody they arrested them? In fact, sometimes it's discouraged, right? It's your business. Not gonna go putting your business out there. But what about kids? Should we tell the parents? Yeah. Now we have to. Why? I'm sorry? Yeah, that's their right. Yeah, they deserve a right to know where their kids are. Outside of, you're taking a kid in for protection against the parent, but even then they should know, just maybe not know where the child is. And hopefully you're taking the parent into custody also. But that was one of the rights that had to be learned. Or, the right to be free from self-incrimination. Now, it wasn't until the 1860s. Well, what did we say? Miranda was 1865, 1867? I'm sorry, 1965, 1967. Before we started giving adults the admonition. But we were treating kids just like adults before that. They had no right. Didn't know they didn't have to talk. What about understanding understanding if a kid understands. I think as adults, we can all know that folks, unless there's some mental issues, some developmental disabilities, things like that, we're just assumed once you become an adult that you know the difference between right and wrong. Another term that you should know, Gladys R. That's a case law. Gladys R, that case was a determining case when it came to the age of understanding. Right around the age of 13, we start wondering, like anything less than that, we start wondering, like, do you really know the difference between right and wrong? And then we have to do, well, how can we know? So if we arrest an 11-year-old for shoplifting, if an 11-year-old shoplifts from Belts, should there be a consequence? Any consequence? I'm not saying arrest, I'm not saying prison. Should there be any consequences for an 11-year-old shoplifting? Yeah. Okay. Then we'll walk our way through the consequences. Should an 11-year-old go to prison? Adult prison? No. So there's our two extremes. What's one of the things we should know before we punish? I mean, if there's got to be consequences. For one, they got to lose the property. Even if you consider the consequence of being stopped and have the property they stole given back to Belts, I mean, that's still a consequence. But if we're going to proceed and put them into the criminal justice system, even the juvenile justice system, what do we need to know about those actions in that juvenile? Oh, criminal history. Yeah, exactly. Is there a chance that 11-year-olds may not know that they weren't supposed to take that stuff? I mean, I'll make it easy for you. Is there a chance that a 3-year-old may not know? If a 3-year-old takes something off a shelf of Belts, is there a chance they didn't know that they weren't supposed to do that? Is there a magical age where that, I mean, I know it, a 40-year-old, if a 40-year-old takes something off a shelf of Belts, do they know that that's wrong? So somewhere between 3 and 40, we know you start to develop right and wrong. But since we can't pin it down, we don't know, that's why we need Gladys R. That case talked about exactly what we're talking about now. So so now you have this 11-year-old, we'll go back to the 11-year-old. Are we in the gray area there between 3 and 40? 11, we're not sure. How are we gonna find out? How are we gonna find out if that 11-year-old knew that was wrong?
Based on, I guess, the attorney, like, asking them questions, usually when.
Bingo. Keep going.
Usually when, like, so a social worker usually asks questions and usually tell whether a child is competent enough to answer these questions by themselves or whether a parent needs. It's usually the child, I wouldn't say that, but usually a person like a social worker or something like that, or CPS and all that stuff, can tell whether a child is able to talk for themselves and know right or not. Sure.
Has reached the age of accountability. Ask them questions. I mean, one of the first questions you could ask them, or at least, one of the most obvious questions you can ask them was, did you know what you did was wrong? We'll see what they say. If they say yes, how did you know? Give me examples of if somebody else had taken this toy from Belts, would that have been wrong? What would you call taking this toy? Would you call it stealing? Is stealing wrong? Who taught you that stealing was wrong? These are all kinds of questions. These aren't necessarily the only questions, but there's a form. There's a Gladys R form that law enforcement officers will have. If somebody's under 13, they can ask them all these questions and determine whether or not they fit they can ask these questions to help determine whether or not the juvenile understands the difference between right and wrong. I'll be right there. Whose job is it to determine whether or not that juvenile offender knew the difference between right and wrong? And I'll give you multiple choice between two choices. The officer arresting or the court. After arresting initially, they're going to ask those questions. But when it comes to interpreting those questions, then that's going to be up to the court. The court is going to decide whether or not they're coming. The officer's not going to ask those Gladys R questions then and be able to analyze and give a thorough. They're still going to enter that juvenile into the system and then have it work itself out. And that'll be part of his defense. Yes.
So, I know you said something about 13. I know with like deciding on like which parents stay with and their divorce and all that stuff, the age is 13 as well. Is that like just a magic number in the children's system or?
I don't know why it's at that. And I'm not even positive that Gladys R case determined that it was 13, or if just the legislature looked at the case law and said we got to pick a number. I'd have to research Gladys R, the case law again. But it just I imagine same thing. The legislature looked at family court or family law and said, well, we got to pick a number, and 13 is right around the time when folks start understanding things.